The scent of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes filled the house, but something sour lingered beneath it, something Harold couldn't name, but felt deep in his bones. The living room sparkled with Christmas lights, the kind Vanessa insisted on wrapping meticulously around the staircase. Greg had cranked up the heat earlier, and the windows fogged gently, giving the whole home that storybook winter feel. Only it wasn't home anymore. Harold sat at the far end of the long dining table, the same one he and Elizabeth had picked out together 25 years ago. The same one where Greg, at 10, had carved his initials with a butter knife when he thought no one was looking. The same table where they once laughed over burnt stuffing and Elizabeth's overly sweet cranberry sauce. Now, the laughter was gone, replaced by murmurs, glass clinks, and that tension Harold recognized all too well, the kind that came before something broke. Greg stood up, holding his wine glass. His movements were too rehearsed, too smooth for a casual toast. Vanessa sat beside him, a polite half-smile on her face, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a delivery. Her expression didn't match the warmth in the room. It was cold, calculated. "I just want to say something real quick," Greg announced, raising his voice slightly. The chatter among the extended family simmered down. Even the kids stopped fiddling with their phones. Harold looked at his son, sensing what was coming. He didn't know the words, but the shape of betrayal, that he knew by heart. Greg cleared his throat. "This year we decided that it's time for a change, for progress." He glanced at Vanessa. "After much discussion and out of concern for everyone's well-being, Dad, we've voted. You're no longer a part of this household." Silence, not dramatic silence, not the kind made for movies, but the kind that falls over people like heavy snow, slow, cold, suffocating. You don't hear it until it's already on your chest. Harold blinked, once, twice. Then he looked around the table. No one met his eyes. Marianne's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. Carolyn's lips parted like she wanted to object, but nothing came out. Harold didn't look at Greg again. He stared at the white tablecloth, noticing a faint stain from last year's gravy. A memory flickered, Elizabeth laughing as she tried to scrub it clean. Gone now. He reached beneath his chair, lifted a plain manila folder, and stood. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, an oddly loud sound in the silence. He walked to Greg and extended the folder. "Here," Harold said, voice calm. "A parting gift." Greg blinked, confused. He took the folder with one hand, his wine glass still in the other. Harold didn't wait for him to open it. He turned and walked away, each step slow but deliberate. His boots thudded gently against the floorboards he'd laid himself, board by board, 2 decades ago. Behind him, someone whispered his name. He didn't turn. At the hallway, he paused for a second. Then he kept walking. The front door creaked open with its usual reluctant groan, and the cold Pittsburgh air slapped his face like a bitter reminder that winter had truly arrived. Snow fell lightly, dotting his coat as he stepped out onto the porch. From inside, he heard nothing. Not a protest, not a goodbye, just the hum of betrayal settling into the bones of the house he built. Outside, the world was quiet. Christmas lights blinked from neighboring homes, cheerful and blind to what had just happened. Harold slid his hands into his pockets. In his right pocket, his fingers curled around something small and metal, the key to the shed behind the garage. Inside were the old blueprints from his engineering days, a few dusty tools, and a fireproof box. Tomorrow, he thought. Not tonight. Tonight they'd celebrate their victory. Let them smile, eat, drink. They had no idea what they'd just started. He didn't go far, just a short walk down the street, boots crunching softly against the dusting of snow. The neighborhood felt different tonight, quieter, colder, though the temperature hadn't dropped. It was the absence of something, belonging maybe, that left Harold feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He made his way to the corner diner, the one that stayed open late even on Christmas Eve. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Warmth and the smell of bacon wrapped him briefly like a blanket. A waitress with tired eyes glanced up from behind the counter. "Hey there, Harold. Coffee?" He nodded, managed a half-smile. "Make it strong." She poured it without another word, sliding the mug toward him. He sat at the far end of the counter, alone, same as every time Elizabeth had late chemo appointments. Same seat, same mug, same waitress. Only now he wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. He stared into the dark coffee, letting the steam rise against his face. His fingers wrapped around the cup, drawing comfort from its heat. He didn't cry. Not tonight. There'd been enough tears in the last few years to soak a lifetime. He was past that stage now. What came next was calculation. Not vengeance, not anger even, just resolve. He pulled out a napkin and reached into his coat pocket for the pen he always carried. It was old, scratched, the clip bent from years of use. He began to write, one word, underlined twice. Blueprint. Then beneath it, Greg's account access, Vanessa's spending patterns, old joint account, still open, property deed status, will, update needed, David, call Monday. Trust option. The list went on, the napkin growing crowded. He flipped it over, kept writing. His handwriting was steady, clear, engineer's penmanship, meant to be read decades later on a job site. Tonight, it would be the start of something else, a different kind of construction. The doorbell jingled again behind him. He didn't turn. The warmth of the mug had cooled now, but he held it tighter. "You okay there, Harold?" the waitress asked quietly. He nodded, just thinking. She gave a sympathetic smile, the kind people offer when they suspect you're hurting but know better than to ask. She refilled the cup and left him alone. Back home, or what used to be home, he didn't go inside, not yet. Instead, he went around to the shed. The lock was rusted, but it still turned. The hinges creaked as he stepped into the small, dusty space. He switched on the single bulb overhead. It flickered once, then glowed steady. Shelves lined the walls, full of old tools, cans of paint, Elizabeth's gardening gloves still hanging by a nail. In the far corner was the fireproof box. Harold dragged it into the center, sat down on an overturned bucket and opened it. Inside were documents, old deeds, insurance papers, savings records, and copies of his will. Outdated now. He picked them up one by one, setting aside anything that no longer reflected his reality. Then he paused. An envelope, faded and yellowing, addressed to Greg in Elizabeth's handwriting. He hadn't seen it in years. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a card, Christmas-themed. A hand-drawn sleigh on the front. Inside, just one sentence. "You'll never be alone, no matter what." Harold closed the card gently, pressing it to his chest. Then he set it down, straightened his shoulders, and reached for a blank sheet of paper. He didn't have Elizabeth's warmth, but he had her strength, and he had a new blueprint to finish. The door to the shed creaked shut behind Harold as the wind picked up, whistling low through the trees like a warning whispered by the night. Snow fell steadily now, blanketing the backyard, softening the outlines of everything it touched. But Harold's mind stayed sharp, clearer than it had in months. Inside the house, Greg and Vanessa were still entertaining the guests, no doubt spinning stories, raising glasses, pretending nothing had happened. He imagined the fireplace crackling, the clink of cutlery on china, Vanessa's laugh, polished and thin as glass. They had no idea what he'd just set in motion. By the time Harold returned to the small guest house he'd been quietly preparing down the block, the coffee had worn off, but the purpose hadn't. He took off his coat, placed the old envelope from Elizabeth on the small kitchen table, and stood for a moment just breathing. The place was modest, bare walls, a twin bed, a coffee maker older than his car, but it was his, and right now, that meant everything. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick leather-bound journal, his old project logbook from back when he worked engineering projects in Buffalo. Every bolt, every delay, every decision, it had all gone into that book. Now it would serve a different kind of build. He flipped to a blank page and started outlining. Not revenge, restoration. He listed the assets: house, pension, savings, accounts he'd co-signed for Greg years ago, ones Greg had never bothered to close. Then the liabilities, emotional, legal, familial. The last one stung the most. Harold didn't want to hurt Greg. That wasn't the goal. There had been a time, not too long ago, when he would have done anything to keep his son close. When Greg lost his first job, Harold had floated him for 6 months. When Vanessa's startup flopped, Harold had paid off the debts to save them embarrassment. And when Elizabeth died, he'd let them move in, thinking the house would feel less empty. Now he knew better. Some things were worse than loneliness. He pulled out a box of old photos, thumbing through them until he found one of Greg at age 6, beaming in a red sweater 2 sizes too big. Elizabeth had made it by hand, insisting the sleeves would fit him next winter. In the photo, Greg clung to Harold's leg, one arm up, laughing with his mouth wide open. That boy was gone, and the man he became had just cut Harold out of his own home. The storm outside rumbled low. The forecast had called for flurries, but Pittsburgh had a habit of ignoring forecasts. Harold closed the box, took a long breath, and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, dry as ever. "Frank? Étonné donc. Maya." "Harold," came the reply, followed by silence. "It's late." "Yeah." "You okay?" Harold hesitated. "They kicked me out, Frank, tonight, during dinner." Another pause. "You want me to come get you?" "I'm all right. Just wanted to talk." "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Harold gave a small chuckle. "I'm thinking like an engineer again." "Good," Frank said. "That's when you're dangerous." The next morning the storm had settled. Pittsburgh's streets were glazed with white, cars buried up to their wheels. But Harold was up early, coat zipped, logbook tucked under one arm, ready. He started at the credit union, the same branch he'd banked with for 30 years. Small, local, the kind where they still remembered your name and offered you coffee you didn't want. The teller smiled as he approached. "Mr. Harold, happy holidays." He nodded. "Need to check on a couple of accounts." Within minutes, he was sitting with a manager, reviewing balances, printing statements, and, most importantly, verifying which accounts Greg still had access to. Turns out, Greg had been quietly dipping into an old shared account tied to Harold's name for months. Small withdrawals, frequent, just under the radar, no more. "Freeze it," Harold said, sliding the statement back. "Effective immediately." The manager blinked. "Of course." From there, Harold walked 2 blocks to Frank's office. Technically retired, Frank still kept a small legal practice for special projects, as he called them. Frank was already waiting, a mug of tea in hand. "Brought your hammer?" he asked. Harold smiled. "Brought the whole toolbox." They sat in the back office, documents spread across the table, deed copies, account printouts, even an old email thread from Greg begging for help back in 2019. Harold moved through it all with quiet efficiency. "Gonna go after the house?" Frank asked. Harold looked up. "I'm going to protect it, from them, from what they've become." Frank nodded slowly. "Then we'll need a trust. A good one." They worked through lunch. By the time Harold left, the framework was in place, trust established, will updated, power of attorney redefined. Greg and Vanessa had no idea they'd just lost control of everything they'd tried to grab. But Harold wasn't done. That evening, he visited Carolyn, Elizabeth's best friend, the one who had sat beside Harold at the hospital, holding his hand when Elizabeth slipped away. Carolyn opened the door with a frown that melted into concern. "Harold?" "I need to talk," he said. "It's about Greg and Vanessa and what they're planning." He laid it out for her, every word, and when he mentioned their plan to declare him unfit and take legal control of the house, Carolyn gasped. "That's monstrous," she said. "I mean, I always knew Vanessa was. Ambitious, but Greg, I can't believe." "You don't have to believe," Harold said. "Just help me make sure no one else does either." She nodded slowly, then firmer. "Whatever you need." He left her house feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. Supported. Back at the guest house, Harold poured himself a scotch, sat at the small table, and opened the logbook again. At the bottom of today's entry, he wrote, "They think this is about power. It's not. It's about dignity, mine, and Elizabeth's memory. Tomorrow, I start gathering proof." He looked out the window. Snow was falling again. Harold stood at the edge of the living room, eyes fixed on the faded family portrait hanging above the mantel. Elizabeth's smile in the photo still looked real, effortless, even now. It had been years, but she hadn't aged a day in that frame. Everyone else had, especially Harold. He pulled on his gloves, then stepped out into the freezing air. Across the street, lights still twinkled in the homes of neighbors. Christmas hadn't ended yet, not for them. But for Harold, the holidays had officially become operational time. That morning, he drove across town to a quiet corner of Pittsburgh where David's office sat tucked between a dentist and a yoga studio. David was a younger man, sharp, efficient, and recommended by Frank for anything that required precision and discretion. Inside, the office smelled of lemon polish and printer toner. David greeted him with a firm handshake. "Frank told me you're looking to secure assets and insulate against family interference." Harold gave a small nod. "You could say that." They sat down. David opened a fresh folder. "Tell me everything." Over the next 2 hours, Harold laid out the situation, quietly, factually. No dramatics. He explained the history of the house, the financial help he'd extended to Greg and Vanessa, their growing entitlement, the Christmas dinner ambush. Then he shared the account statements, the paper trail, and the plans he and Frank had drafted. David listened without interruption, only pausing to scribble notes. When Harold finished, the lawyer leaned back. "You're doing the right thing. A trust is the smartest move. We can make it ironclad, irrevocable. They won't touch it." Harold folded his hands. "And the power of attorney?" "Revoked. We'll reissue new documentation. You'll keep full control." David slid over a draft of the trust agreement. "Sign here to begin." Harold took the pen, paused, and then signed his name. The stroke was steady. Another piece in place. That night, he met Frank at the Iron Lantern, a local dive bar they used to frequent when both their kids were in high school. The lights were dim, the jukebox stuck on Johnny Cash, and the bartender poured drinks without asking for stories. Harold sipped a dark beer and slid a manila folder across the table. Frank opened it. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages Greg had sent him over the past year, ones filled with entitlement, subtle threats, and manipulation. There were bank withdrawal receipts, photos of broken agreements, and a partial recording Harold had captured a week before Christmas of Vanessa ranting about how the old man's time is up. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." Harold took another sip. "They want to play chess. I'm just moving pieces." Frank chuckled. "Remind me never to cross you." In the following days, Harold became a ghost in his own story. He stopped by the main house only when no one was home, usually mid-morning, when Greg and Vanessa were both at work. He knew their schedules better than they did. A side key still worked. They hadn't thought to change the locks. He moved through the house with quiet precision. In Greg's office, he found unopened letters, overdue notices, and a personal credit card bill showing luxury purchases, spa trips, designer coats, electronics, all bought in the past month. In Vanessa's wellness space, he found scribbled plans for a home renovation, plans that included converting Harold's old room into a yoga studio. They'd already erased him in their minds. He took photos of everything. On his way out, he paused in the hallway, staring at the empty spot where Elizabeth's painting once hung. He'd taken it down himself the week before, knowing they'd toss it eventually. It now hung in his guest house, one piece of the past he refused to leave behind. Back at the guest house, Harold reviewed the files on his laptop. He organized each document into folders: spending, statements, verbal evidence, legal drafts. The logbook filled quickly. He added a new entry. They think they're moving forward, but they've already stepped off the ledge. That evening, he sat in his recliner, the one piece of furniture he brought with him, and called Marianne. She answered with surprise in her voice. "Harold, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "I need to ask a favor, something important." Marianne hesitated. "What is it?" "I need you to be at Greg and Vanessa's New Year dinner, and I need you to record it." A pause. "You expecting fireworks?" Harold gave a dry laugh. "No, I'm lighting the fuse." The days moved fast. Harold met with David again to finalize the trust and will updates. He transferred ownership of the house into the trust, ensuring it was no longer legally tied to Greg. He set up a clause. If anyone attempted to challenge his mental capacity or manipulate access, the trust would automatically revoke their inheritance. He also added a charitable clause. If Greg pushed too far, everything would go to a local scholarship foundation in Elizabeth's name. David read it over. Brutal, but fair. Harold nodded. "I'm not here to punish. I'm here to protect." One afternoon, Harold received a call from Carolyn. "I heard from Marianne. She's nervous. Greg's been acting strange. He keeps asking about your mental state." Harold sighed. "That's their next move. Try to have me declared incompetent." Carolyn's voice tightened. "Do they have any evidence?" "None that's true," Harold said. "But people don't need truth. They just need noise." "Well, I've got your back, and so does Marianne." "I know, that's why I called." By the week's end, Harold had assembled everything: physical evidence, digital copies, witnesses, legal documentation. The final step was simple. He wrote a letter, short, titled, "To Greg and Vanessa." He didn't include anger. He didn't threaten. He just laid out facts: how he knew, when he knew, what he'd done to ensure they couldn't touch what wasn't theirs. Then at the bottom, he added, "I won't be at dinner this year, but I've left you a folder. You should open it before dessert." He smiled, folded the letter, and slid it into a fresh manila envelope. The blueprint was complete. New Year's Eve was just 3 days away, and the house on Whitmore Street was being prepped like a stage for a show. Vanessa had ordered extra lights to be strung across the entryway, and Greg had reserved a private chef, one of those home experience types who did multi-course meals and made a big deal about every spoonful. They were planning a night to remember, and Harold intended to make sure they got exactly that. He sat in the corner booth of a quiet cafe on 4th Street, a half-drunk cup of black coffee growing cold in front of him. Across the table, Carolyn leaned in, her voice just above a whisper. "You're sure they're going to do it then?" she asked. "Try to declare you incompetent in front of the family?" Harold nodded once. "Greg's too proud to do it in private. He wants to humiliate me, frame it as a mercy act. Vanessa calls it intervening for his good." Carolyn shook her head, disgusted. "What they're doing isn't just cruel, it's surgical." Harold didn't reply. His mind was already elsewhere, lining up the next moves. He slid a flash drive across the table. "This has everything: recordings, financials, proof of manipulation, Greg's debts, Vanessa's emails, all of it." Carolyn raised an eyebrow. "You recorded them?" "Not illegally. I was present for all of it. Pennsylvania's a one-party consent state." She smirked. "Well, aren't you just the quiet revolutionary?" Harold let out a breath. "I'm not looking for war, just truth." That night, Harold waited until Greg and Vanessa had left the house for dinner with friends before using the spare key again. He moved with quiet confidence, careful not to disturb anything. The manila envelope was already prepared. He slid it beneath Greg's seat at the long dining table, taping it lightly to the underside. He took one last look at the room, the wine glasses already set, the polished silverware, the cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. A perfect scene. He almost smiled. The next morning, he met Marianne at her work. She was nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she sat beside him in the break room. "I don't like secrets," she said softly. "You don't have to keep any," Harold replied. "Just press record, that's all." She looked down at the small voice recorder he placed in her palm. "Vanessa trusts you," he added. "They won't suspect a thing." Marianne hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Meanwhile, Frank was coordinating from behind the scenes. He had already arranged for 2 neutral observers, retired professionals who had previously worked in adult protection services. Both would attend the dinner, disguised as friends of Carolyn's, under the pretense of being old family friends visiting from out of town. Harold had paid them out of pocket, not for testimony but for presence, to witness, to ensure the confrontation couldn't be spun as delusion or fabrication. It was all about the setup. 2 days before the dinner, Vanessa hosted a small planning brunch. Harold wasn't invited, of course, but Carolyn managed to slip in. She reported back that Vanessa had rehearsed Greg's speech, complete with talking points about early dementia signs and erratic behavior. "They're going to present it like a group decision," Carolyn said, "like it's for your own protection." Harold nodded, unsurprised. That's why the truth has to land first, hard. On New Year's Eve, Harold didn't wear a suit. He didn't plan to stay long. He arrived an hour before the dinner officially began, under the cover of helping with last-minute errands. Vanessa had rolled her eyes but let him in. He moved calmly through the house, greeting people, shaking hands. Most smiled politely, unsure of how to act. No one mentioned Christmas. No one asked where he'd been. At 6:42 p.m., he slipped out unnoticed. He returned to the guest house, lit a fire in the small hearth, and poured himself a glass of scotch. Then he waited. 7 o'clock p.m. The dinner began. 7:12 p.m. Greg stood to make an announcement. 7:14 p.m. Marianne pressed record. 7:17 p.m. Greg lifted his wine glass, glanced at Vanessa and began speaking, and at 7:20 p.m. he reached under his chair to pull out the envelope Harold had left. What happened next, Harold didn't see, but he'd written the script. Inside the envelope were 5 things. 1. A notarized revocation of power of attorney. 2. A copy of the trust agreement, showing the house was no longer in Greg's name, nor would it ever be. 3. Bank statements with highlighted withdrawals and dates. 4. Transcripts of recorded conversations, complete with time codes. 5. A single note, handwritten in Harold's script. I built this house with my hands. I raised my family with my heart. I won't let either be stolen. Harold. Carolyn would later tell him that the silence in the room was so thick you could hear the candles flicker. Vanessa stood frozen, white as the linens. Greg sat with the envelope in his hands, mouth slightly open, as if the words had vanished from his tongue. And then came the murmurs, the questions. What is this? Is that true? You took money from him? You were going to have him declared incompetent? Marianne pressed stop on the recorder. One of the guests cleared his throat and calmly introduced himself as a retired APS specialist. His friend followed suit. Their presence, combined with the documents, shattered any illusions Vanessa and Greg had tried to create. It wasn't just a failed ambush. It was a full public collapse. At 9:03 p.m., Harold's phone buzzed, a single message from Carolyn. It's done. Harold didn't reply. He stared at the fire, then walked to the window. Snow had started falling again, slow and silent. His scotch sat untouched. He didn't feel victorious, just free. New Year's Day was silent, cold, the kind of cold that settled in your joints and reminded you were no longer 30. Harold woke before dawn, not because of nerves, but because that was what his body did now. Wake early, get moving, stay sharp. He brewed coffee slowly, methodically. Black, no sugar. That folder, sat on the table, not the one he'd left at Greg's house. This was the master copy. Every receipt, every transcript, every legal filing, all of it in perfect order. He didn't need it anymore. Last night had done its work, but what Harold hadn't expected was what came next. At 10:43 a.m., someone knocked on the guest house door. He opened it to find Marianne, wrapped in a long gray coat, holding a paper bag. They left early, she said. Didn't say goodbye to anyone. Harold nodded slowly. And the others? Confused, angry. Some embarrassed. Carolyn tried to smooth things over, but you could see it in their faces. They saw what happened, really saw it. She held out the bag. Carolyn sent you this, coffee cake and about 6 apologies. Harold smiled faintly. Tell her I'm all right. Marianne stepped closer. They're scared of you now. I don't want them to be scared, Harold said. I just wanted them to stop. You did. She lingered a moment, then turned and walked back into the snow. By the afternoon, the fallout began. Greg's number flashed on his phone twice. Harold let it ring. Voicemail, no message. Vanessa sent a long email, 5 paragraphs, no apology. Instead, a mix of explanations, shifting blame, talk of stress and misunderstandings. She used the word family 3 times. Harold didn't respond. That evening, Frank stopped by with a 6-pack and a tired grin. You broke them, he said, flopping onto the guest house couch like he owned it. Harold raised an eyebrow. That wasn't the point. I know, but still, you broke them. Harold leaned back in his chair. I think they broke themselves. Frank tossed him a bottle. You know what I admire most? You never raised your voice. You didn't scream, you just delivered. Noise is for people who don't have evidence. Frank laughed. Preach, engineer. They drank in silence for a while, comfortable, familiar. At one point, Frank asked, You regret any of it? Harold didn't answer right away. Then, softly, Only that I didn't see it sooner. 2 days later, Harold returned to the main house. It was empty. Greg and Vanessa had left early for a trip. More likely a retreat. He wasn't there to reclaim anything, just to see it one last time. The living room looked untouched, but the energy had shifted. The warmth, Elizabeth's warmth, was long gone. All that remained were things, expensive, curated, cold. In the hallway he paused before a closed door. His old room, still labeled Dad in Vanessa's handwriting on the whiteboard next to the frame. He opened it slowly. Empty. Not stripped, just emptied. No photos, no books, no chair. The room had been cleared out like an erasure. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he closed it, walked out, and didn't look back. That night, he sat with the logbook. Final entry. They wanted a performance. I gave them documentation. They wanted to erase me. I made sure I was written in ink, not for revenge, for memory. He closed the book, exhaled slowly, and reached for a clean page. This one was different. At the top he wrote, "Next chapter." The following week, a letter arrived, from Greg. Handwritten. Unfolded carefully, it read, "Dad, I don't know what to say. I'm angry at myself, at Vanessa, at you too a little, if I'm honest. I never thought it would go that far, but I let it, and you let me. Maybe that's why it happened. I hope one day we talk. I hope you'll still pick up. Greg." Harold read it twice. Then he folded it, placed it in the box with Elizabeth's Christmas card from years ago. Not to forgive, not yet, but to remember. February crept in quietly, blanketing the streets of Chicago with snow, as if trying to cover up everything that came before. Harold had moved into the new apartment at the start of the year, but only now did it start to feel like home. There were no more creaking floors or footsteps overhead. Just the soft hiss of the coffee maker in the morning, the distant hum of a neighbor's radio, and silence, the kind that gave him room to breathe. Every morning, he wrote. Not letters, not legal forms, just scattered thoughts, memories, sometimes feelings. Some days he wrote about Elizabeth, others about Greg as a boy, and sometimes just a single line, "I'm still here." In the afternoons, he walked by the lake. Same path, different pace, no longer escaping, no longer mourning, just moving forward. One afternoon, Carolyn visited. She brought apple pie and a worn book Elizabeth had once loved. "She read this every winter," Carolyn said as she set it gently on the shelf. "Now it belongs here." Harold didn't speak, just nodded. A silent thank you. They drank tea in no rush. When she left, he placed the book beside Elizabeth's photo. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Some things just need to be. On the 47th day in the apartment, he reopened Greg's letter. This time, not just to read, but to respond. "Greg, thank you for writing. It's the first thing you've sent me in years. I don't forgive easily. Maybe I never will. But I also won't live the rest of my life bitter. You used to be a boy who knew how to apologize. If the man you are today is still that boy, maybe someday we'll sit at the same table again. But not today. Dad." He didn't know if Greg would reply, but that wasn't the point. In March, Harold planted flowers on his balcony. 3 pots, one for Elizabeth, one for himself, and one to be earned. The apartment began to smell like fresh leaves. Sunlight poured through the windows. Life started to take shape, not because someone told him how to live, but because he chose to. He still kept copies of the eviction letter, the court papers, everything, but they stayed tucked in a tin box above the stove, not for revenge, just as a reminder, I made it through. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.